Hey, what's going on, guys? My name's Griffin and I am a filmmaker based out of Orange County, California. And today we're gonna take a look at the Canon C500 Mark II versus the Canon C200. Okay, so jumping right into it, I don't wanna bore you guys too much with the spec sheets because obviously you can just go on BH Photo or Adorama and read those for yourself. But the things that really stood out to me, the first one was gonna be the fact that the C500 Mark II is a full frame camera versus the Super 35 in the C200. The second one is gonna be the fact that it can shoot anamorphic and the C200 can't. The third thing is going to be the fact that it has user swappable mounts, so you can swap between EF and PL. And then the last main feature of the C500 Mark II that the C200 doesn't have is it has electronic stabilization built into the body, and it's actually pretty good. So this video is going to be broken down into three main sections. The first one is going to be image quality, the second one is going to be ergonomics, and the third one is going to be user experience. But what I wanted to do is really take a look at the codecs that I would personally use and kind of see how the C200 stacks up against the C500 Mark II and sort of answer the question, would the Canon C200 be a really good B camera for the C500 Mark II? Short answer is yes, it would be. So we'll go a little more in depth than that though. Okay, so this is a little test in the Super 35 crop sensor mode of the C500 Mark II, and this is shooting in XF AVC, and we're gonna click over to the RAW. So this is the Super 35 version of the RAW, and this is with the exact same LUT applied as the XF AVC. And here's the exact same camera settings on the C200 in RAW. And here's the 8-bit XF AVC from the C200. And for this one's a little different. It's not in CLOG 2. All the other tests are in CLOG 2, but CLOG 2 is not an available option in the 8-bit XF AVC. So this is in CLOG 3. And here's a quick look at all four of the images side by side from both C200 images and both C500 images. The only one that I think doesn't match too well is the CLOG 3 in 8-bit. All the other ones I think actually look really good. So after taking a look at some of the footage, I figured this is easier than trying to deal with YouTube compression. I could just show you guys what I'm looking at. So if we look at the saturation right here, this is showing us the saturation in the XF AVC. And then when we click over to the RAW, you see it expand a little bit. That means there's a little bit more saturation in the RAW and a little bit less in the XF AVC. Not a huge deal. You can always just bump the saturation to about 108 or 110, and then they're gonna match pretty much. The next thing I noticed about the footage between the C500 RAW and the C500 XF AVC is the magenta. So if we click over, this is going to show us the RAW magenta levels here. And then we click over to the XF AVC. You notice how that's a little bit less there. A little more for the RAW, a little bit less for the XF AVC. So jumping over to the C200 footage, this is this C200 versus the C500 footage. I actually thought the XF AVC from the C500 and the RAW from the C200 matched the best out of all the modes, which was pretty exciting because if you want to jump between those two in a project, it's going to be nice. You can have smaller file sizes with the XF AVC for something like a documentary. So if you notice the saturation levels again are a little bit higher on the RAW from the C200 than the XF AVC. So here's the CLOG 3 footage. I tried my best to match this. I just hate the magenta levels. I don't think it looks good. I think the saturation match is okay because I manually matched that. I think the contrast levels match okay. But what I really don't like is just how my skin looks overall. I think it looks kind of unhealthy and red. Okay, next up is the high ISO, starting out with the C500 Mark II in full frame RAW and moving into XF AVC. This one's looking super clean. And now we're in Super 35 on the C500 in RAW. And now we're in Super 35 XF AVC. And finally, here's the C200 in RAW. And for the sake of the test, we'll jump into a 200% crop so you can take a look and see what that's going to look like. And you can see the full frame XF AVC on the C500 just really looks really nice in low light. There's definitely some great noise reduction going on there. All right, so moving on to section 2. The second section is ergonomics. This is something that is a little harder to tell from a spec sheet. You can't exactly tell, or looking at someone's images online, you don't know necessarily how much of a headache it was to get those images. So what I personally look for in a camera is I want something that has great image quality, but I also want it to be enjoyable to use. I want to feel inspired to go shoot when I pick up the camera. And also I don't want to have to fuss around with too many things where I feel like I'm fighting the camera instead of being able to focus on capturing the best images. So fortunately, the C500 Mark II really improves on a lot of the things from the C200. I get it, no camera can be perfect, but these are just some personal things that I found for my style of shooting that make them a little bit annoying, and they were improved in the C500 Mark II. So the first one being the HDMI port. If you see on this camera, let's see if that'll focus. So the HDMI port is like way down here at the bottom, and then if you're running to an external recorder, it's got to go up here, and I'll sort of hold this out, but you get this crazy looking cable where it just hangs all the way out. On the C500 Mark II, they put the HDMI like on the very top right there. So it's a little closer, and you could run an even shorter cable or even run your cable a little bit neater than on the C200. So that's a big improvement. I know it seems small, but like once you've shot on these cameras a ton, these little small things will kind of get to annoy you. So that was one thing I noticed that I really liked. Second thing is light up buttons on the C500 Mark II. They added those where they weren't available on the C200. It's not that big a deal because, to be honest, when I'm operating the camera, I know it so well that I don't really have to look at the buttons while I'm operating. And to be honest, if you don't know where your buttons are right away, I mean, the reality is you should probably work with your camera a little bit more and really get to know that, because it's important when you're shooting. You don't want to have to like think about where your buttons are. You just want to operate and go. But if someone else is using your camera, like you have a second operator that's maybe not as familiar with your camera, it's really good that the light up buttons are there so they can kind of see. They just hit the little light up button on the side, all the buttons illuminate, and then they're able to see what they're doing while they're operating in the dark. So the third thing, which was a pretty huge improvement, is they added a larger, nicer monitor. I'm not sure if it's really brighter or not. It's not the easiest to see if you're in like direct sunlight, but I would say it compares really well to something like Atomos Ninja 5 or an Atomos Shinobi as far as brightness. So it's definitely daylight viewable. You can use it for sure. It's not something that if the sun is blasting right on your monitor that you're gonna be able to see perfectly well. I mean, you'd probably want to use a sun hood, but I bought one for 20 bucks from Small Rig, and it does a pretty good job for my C200. So I'm assuming they'll probably come out with one for the C500 Mark II as well. So hopefully I'll be able to get away with using the stock monitor instead of having to add on a second external monitor. Another thing with the monitor that's a big improvement that I talked about in my last video was they pushed all the information out to the sides, or let me say they added a mode where you can push all the information out to the sides, and you can get a nice clean looking image where there's no distractions on your image. You can just focus on the image, but you can still see your volume, you can still see your frame rate, you can still see all that stuff that's important to see while you're shooting. Okay, so moving on to the next thing, they moved the volume controls on the C500 Mark II to the bottom right. So it's a little bit of a worse place if you're solo opping, because typically the way you grip the camera is you're gonna have your right hand here if you're doing, say, like an interview or something like that, and then your left hand is probably on the lens getting ready to focus. So it'd be kind of like that. And that's usually how I operate. And then if the subject moves, you can, you know, if your autofocus starts going crazy, you can just flick it over to manual focus and take over from there. And so what I'll usually do is I'll put my left hand on these volume controls, like my thumb, and I'll ride the volume up or down depending on how loud the subject is talking. So on the C500 Mark II, what they did is they added them to the bottom right on the same side as your grip. So if you got your grip, you would have to take your hand out of the grip and then adjust them down here. So that's kind of a worse position if you're solo opping, because you're probably not gonna wanna like slide your hand all the way out, but it is a better position if you wanna add a V-mount to the back of your camera. So if you wanna get the V-mount nice and tight to your camera so it's easier to balance, just for handheld, it's definitely a better position. So it's kind of a trade-off. I kind of like it, to be honest. Okay, so another thing they did is they added an extra screw hole on the bottom of the C500 Mark II. The C200 only has these two right here. So if you have a little short plate like I have on right here, it's totally fine. This is one that's compatible, I think it's from Small Rig, and it's compatible with the Ronin S. So that's kind of why I like this one. And it's also compatible with all my Manfrotto tripods. But they added a third hole. So if you have sort of a long base plate on there, it's not gonna flex as much, because what would happen is you would get some flex in the back of the base plate, and you'd kind of feel, if you had your camera built out in a bigger configuration, you'd feel like it just had a little bit of flex to it if you had like a V-mount hanging off the back. So that's definitely a bonus that they added a third hole so you can secure your camera a little bit better. So another improvement I found on the C500 Mark II was the top handle design. I really liked how they kept the same top handle. I actually really like the top handle. Like I bought a $200 one from Wooden Camera that's all metal, and I just found it to be super uncomfortable on my hand. I actually really kind of like the way that the grooves are on the plastic in the stock C200 handle, and it's pretty much the same handle. And the improvement was the way that it mounts to the camera. It doesn't necessarily need that second screw. So on the C200, there's this like big thumb screw, which is easy to screw in, and then there's a second screw, which makes it kind of secure. And if you don't have that one, it always kind of comes loose throughout the day. On the C500 Mark II, it's sort of like this cold shoe situation where it just kind of slides in there, and it's really secure. Like you could just slide it in the cold shoe and then use the one single thumb screw to put it on, and that thing's not going anywhere. The next thing I found that I liked about the C500 Mark II that was a little better than the C200 was the fact that it has more outputs. So as you're sending your signal on the C200, you get the option to send either HDMI or SDI. That's it. There's no second output. On the C500 Mark II, you basically gain one additional one. And on the C200, it's a 3G SDI out, whereas on the C500 Mark II, it's a 12G SDI out. So like, what does that mean? Well, what it means is you can send a 4K 10-bit 422 signal out of the SDI on the C500 Mark II, and you can't do that on the C200. That's pretty huge if you want to use something like a Ninja 5 or a Shogun, and you want to get those ProRes files, and maybe you don't want to buy the expensive media, you just want to record external. Well, that's going to be a really good option for you. Last thing about the C500 Mark II that was an improvement over the C200 was, I would say the overall build quality just feels a little bit more solid. A lot of the parts are kind of borrowed. Like I think it's the same side handle grip, which I always really liked, but the body itself, I don't know what materials they used, but it just feels a little bit more solid, and it kind of feels like maybe it's going to last a little bit longer. And if you are in, say, the rental market, it'll probably hold up to rental abuse a little bit better than the C200 would. Okay, so jumping into the user experience, this is kind of the stuff that you just find the things you like, the things you don't like by using the camera. I've operated the C200 for close to, I think, like almost 800 or 900 hours. So I've really gotten to know that camera super well. The C500 Mark II, I really only operated 2 days. So I haven't gotten to know the camera in and out like I have on the C200. But first thing I noticed was the battery life is about half. So these guys right here, this is the BPA 30. These ones on the C200 last for 2 hours, and then the bigger ones, the BPA 60s, they last for 4 hours. On the C500 Mark II, the BPA 30s, I think we're getting close to an hour, and the BPA 60s, we're getting close to 2 hours. Like I get it, it's shooting like in these heavier codecs, and it's shooting full frame, so I get why it's going to burn through batteries faster. That definitely is a little bit of a bummer, but I don't see it as the end of the world, because the next thing is the C500 Mark II has significantly faster startup times. So on the C200, I typically don't power it down between takes, especially if I'm doing like a dock situation. That's kind of when battery life matters the most to me. So if I'm out shooting all day, I need to have my camera ready to capture whatever action is going to happen. If there's kind of like something that there's not much going on for, say, like 20 minutes or 10 minutes even, I'm probably just keeping my camera on, just because if something happens, I want to be able to pick it up and start shooting and capture that moment. With the C500 Mark II, the startup time is, I don't know, I'll put it on the screen right here, but it's significantly faster than the C200. And for me, I think in the real world, what I would do is I'd wind up powering that camera down a lot more often than I would the C200, because I know if something happens, I could just turn that camera on and right away start capturing the action. Whereas just those extra couple seconds on the C200, I find that I would wind up just keeping the camera on and burning the battery all the way through. Next thing I found is the ND filters on the C500 Mark II go down a lot slower. I know it's putting the ND filter over the full frame glass, but that's something I noticed for sure. Whereas on the C200, you could go from like indoors to outdoors and say it's like 4 stops or 6 stops exposure change. You could click through those things right away, and it's almost instantaneous. I've even used them in an edit where I show the ND filters changing. The C500 Mark II is a little slower. I'd say it's comparable to like an Amira, an Arri Amira. Like it goes a lot slower for the ND filters, but it's not the end of the world. I don't think it would change the way I shoot much, but just something to be noted. Another thing I found on the C500 Mark II is when you switch between RAW and XFAVC, it does not switch to 60p. Like, why on the C200 they haven't fixed this? When you switch from RAW to XFAVC, it just reverts to 60p all the time. I don't know, I don't get it. I don't know why this isn't updated. Everybody complains about it. It like shouldn't cost money for Canon, or like it doesn't like change the way that they differentiate the cinema line, but that's something to note about the C200. It always switches to 60p when you go from RAW to XFAVC, and it doesn't do that on the C500 Mark II, so that's awesome. Okay, so another huge win for the C500 Mark II is you can actually monitor in CLOG 2. On the C200, you can only monitor in CLOG 3 when you're shooting RAW. I don't really know why this is, because when you import it into Premiere or DaVinci or whatever you're using, it automatically defaults to CLOG 2. So you're not exactly monitoring on set or on location exactly what you're gonna get in the edit. So you can always change it back to CLOG 3, but I always prefer to shoot CLOG 2. And on the C200, there's no option to shoot, or rather to monitor in CLOG 2. So that's really nice. Another huge thing is you can actually add custom user LUTs. So if you're shooting with a client, you already kind of know the look you want to have in mind, and you want your client to be able to see that, you're able to add the LUT right to your camera. So if maybe you don't have a client monitor set up and you just want to show them on your camera what it's going to look like, they're able to get a little better feel for what the final image is going to look like, because you can show them with your user LUT on it. So in terms of autofocus on the C200, I was always really happy with it. I felt it was about the same on the C500 Mark II, really solid. There's two main modes I used. So the first one is the face only tracking, and the second one is just the wide continuous autofocus. And you can select it with the touchscreen where you want that to be. One thing that I never liked though is the modes that you get on the 1DX Mark III, where you can just tap your subject and then it's gonna grab onto that subject and track it. That's available on the C200, but you have to, it's like a two-touch thing. So you have to press your tracking button, and then you have to tap on the screen what you want your subject to track. And if it loses it, you can't just like press it right away. So on the 1DX, it has one-touch tracking. So if you're tracking, say like an athlete running across the field or something like that, you can continue to tap on the back of the screen. Whereas with the C200, you have to press your assignable button for the tracking and then touch the screen. And then if the autofocus loses it, you have to press the assignable button again and then tap your screen. So it's like a two-touch thing, which I always find makes it pretty much unusable for me. It's just a little bit too slow of a workflow. Whereas with the 1DX Mark II, or I'm sure the 1DX Mark III will have the same mode when I get that in a few weeks, you're able to just tap it. Even like the 6D Mark II that I have, I find that the autofocus tracking is a little bit easier to use, especially if you give it to an operator that hasn't had quite as much experience with the camera. Okay, so another huge improvement on the C500 Mark II over the C200 was the way you toggle between the regular recording mode and the media mode. On the C200, I find it's just a really slow process to switch between the regular shooting mode and the media mode. And if like someone on set's like, hey, can we get a playback of that last clip? You're like, okay. But what I ended up doing was assigning a customizable button on the back of the camera. So on all the C200s in our production, this button, number 8, is actually the previous clip playback. So you just hit 8 and it's gonna play the last clip that you just shot back. And then when you play that, it'll play the one clip and then that's it. And there's no way to really scrub through that footage at all. On the C500 Mark II, you still can't scrub through the footage. Like I even find on the, say like the 6D Mark II, I find it's even easier, and like pretty much all the lower end Canon cameras, you can just literally go like on the back of the screen and use your finger to just scrub right through. On the C200 and the C500 Mark II, you can't do that. So that's unfortunate. But what is an improvement is when you press play on the clip, it'll play all your clips that you just shot in a row. So for example, if I go back 4 or 5 clips in the menu and then I hit play, and then it's gonna play that clip, and then once that clip's done, it's gonna move to the next clip, and then to the next clip, and to the next clip. So that's really nice if you wanna go back, say 4 or 5 clips and watch the last 4 or 5 takes of something. You can just do that right in a row. You don't have to use the joystick to go in and individually select each clip. So overall, I would say I'm really happy with the improvements in the C500 Mark II. Is it a perfect camera? No, of course not. There's still some things I'd like to see improved, but over the C200, especially if you are a C200 user already, you're probably gonna find the C500 Mark II to have a lot of welcomed additions. So anyways, that's it for me today, guys. Thanks for coming and checking this out. I've been super happy with everybody that's been watching these videos and leaving the really encouraging comments. That's really cool for me to see. So seriously, like, thank you. Like, it's really awesome to see this community grow, and hopefully we can all kind of help each other out here. If you like this kind of content, stick around and maybe consider hitting that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.